Welcome to another episode of The Evaluation Couch, the podcast where we talk about career growth and the field of evaluation. This is your host, Maria Montenegro. In this week's episode, we are going to discuss a topic that is very important for our careers, our experiences of feeling like an imposter. And I am so grateful that I have my dear friend, John LaVelle, here to tell us about his research and his work around this topic. John, thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, can you please tell us a little bit about you and your work?
Thanks, Maria. It's a real treat to be able to spend some time with you today. And hello to all my friends in evaluation world. My name is John LaVelle. I'm a researcher. I'm a teacher of evaluation. I have a bit of a background in health and psychology. And a lot of what I focus my work on is answering this question of who am I? Who are we as a field? And how do we bring our best selves to the work we do so that we can show up the very best for the people that we're trying to support and serve, which are our community partners.
I love that introduction. Thank you so much for sharing that, John. Can you tell us a little bit about your research career? How many years have you been doing research on these big questions to support our evaluation profession? What are some of the main areas that you have focused on?
Research and careers are often in the eye of the beholder, to be honest with you. I've been an evaluator since about 2002 when I first was introduced to it as a formal field. I'd say that I really grew into the research on evaluation role probably in the early 2010s when I started asking, well, with a lot of support, we'll be honest about that, a lot of guidance, a lot of patience of my advisors and my friends, I started asking questions around what are the job competencies needed to do good evaluation work? And of course, the answer is it depends on the context, on the people that we're trying to serve. I did a lot of work on evaluator education. So the formal ways that we can prepare evaluators to do this work, either through formal graduate programs is one route, professional development and communities of practice are another. How are the best ways to prepare the people who want to do this work? In the last 6 or 7 years, I've become even more interested in this idea of evaluator identity, the values, the ethics, the philosophy, and the psychology of evaluators themselves. And so I look at things, again, with coworkers, with co-authors, with my proteges. I can't do any of this alone. I need good people around me. We'll ask questions about the imposter phenomenon. We ask questions around evaluators' values. One of my amazing doctoral students looks at professional identity development, and another one looks at the ethical orientations of people who identify as evaluators. They care about all those things, and I do too. My particular lens on it is how do we use this information to improve both practice and the educational supports for people like me, for people like you, who are trying to do the work well.
I love that. And I do want to share a bit of a backstory behind the scenes of how we ended up being in this podcast episode together. I know you, John, from way back. I can't even remember how we met, but I know that you've been one of the first friendly faces that has welcomed me into the community, especially at the American Evaluation Association, where I didn't move a lot before. I really have always appreciated you for that. But also, as I've been developing my coaching program, The Evaluator's Edge, which I'm going to launch in January, I've been doing a lot of research to understand what are the pain points, what are the challenges that people in evaluation face in their careers.
Sure.
The very few pieces, evidence, content around this topic has been your work. Yeah. So from the very early stages of developing my coaching program, I've known this was going to happen, and I'm very happy to have you here. That's exactly the reason why you're here, right? To talk about one specific study that you have around evaluators' imposter phenomenon. I would love to hear about what motivated you to look into this topic and do this study.
Sure. Before I get into that story, I feel like the first time I met you was at the Canadian Evaluation Society meeting a few years ago. If I remember right, you were walking in front of me, I was walking behind, and we both ended up stopping at a stoplight, and you had the Canadian Evaluation Society name tag on. I thought, Here's a nice person. I'm just going to say hi and let's see where it goes. She might think I'm a total weirdo and she'd be right. Or she could say, hey, let's have a conversation too. And if I remember right, we just ended up walking to the conference center after that. I'm thrilled to have been a kind bridge to the AEA. You were one of my kind bridges to CES. And so for that, I'm very grateful.
I love that story. My memory is so terrible. I do not remember that. I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
Let's just take that as truth, or at least a relative truth, because again, memory is a funny thing. There's a couple things. This is my recollection of how my colleagues and I embarked on this study. We should probably talk to them to make sure I'm not completely misremembering it, but I think it'll be pretty consistent. So when I was an early professor, I was at the American Evaluation Association, and there was a birds of a feather lunch meeting. And if you haven't been to a birds of a feather, it was a large conference room with lots of round tables, 8 to 12 seats at each one. And there was a one topic at each one, and there was a host or a hostess, and that person was going to help facilitate a conversation. So I went to the one about research on evaluation. I remember sitting there with a person named Natalie Jones, who was a doctoral student at Claremont Graduate University, which is where I emerged from. She and I were contemporaries. I was just a little bit further along than she was. We had the conversation about research on evaluation. How do we support it? What's working well? The conversation slowed down after a few minutes. Natalie and I started a side conversation about our feelings, about what does it feel like to be an evaluator. Now, I don't remember who said it first, so I'm going to say it was me. I think I said something about there are just some days where I feel like a fake. I feel like I'm faking this. I I know evaluation, I know teaching, but for heaven's sakes, I really feel like I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time half the time. And what do I really know about this? And Natalie, if I remember correctly, looked at me and said something like, you feel that too? Oh my God, we have to talk. By sharing my own feelings, she then had permission to share her feelings about it. One thing led to another, and I said, this sounds like an empirical question. It sounds like the imposter phenomenon. Maybe let's take a look at what's around. Let's take a look at what work has been done on imposterism and see what we can learn about it for us, for the field. And so we went our separate ways. I kept teaching and doing research, and she kept doing her stuff too. After about 2 months, we said, there's nothing in our professional literature about feelings of being fake. That can't be right. What we found is that as you look at the literature, there's lots of really smart people telling us what to do in evaluation, how to show up, what questions to ask, what community partners to engage with. But there was relatively little, if anything, about evaluators themselves. Who are we? How do we show up? What are our strengths? What are some of our insecurities? What are some of our fears about this work? And she and I said, let's do a data-based study about it. So we reached out to the original author of the imposter phenomenon, Clance and Imes, and said, we would really like your permission to do a study on this topic, and we would like to build it from the foundation that you provided in the 1970s and early 1980s. And she said yes. Total oh my gosh moment, right? She said yes. And so Natalie and I adapted some of the tools, some of the questions that Clance used to discuss imposterism. We made them focused for evaluators. Before we launched the study, there was one other person that I knew we needed. Natalie's amazing. I show up however I show up. But there was one other person who I really wanted, and his name is Scott Donaldson. In all fairness, he's the son of my advisor, Stuart Donaldson. That had nothing to play in here. I wanted Scott because he is so gifted in statistics and quantitative analysis. I'm okay with those things. He takes those skills to a whole other level. And I thought, if I'm going to talk about something as important as imposterism, as personal as imposterism, I need someone that I can really trust to work on the data either with me or for me. This is not an area where I want to make mistakes because it's people's lives and experiences on the line. After that, it's just research methods. We reached out to the American Evaluation Association. and said, would you be willing to let us ask questions of your members? They said yes. And there we go. Send out the survey, do all the wonderful statistics and analysis. And then we've been able to come up with a story that I think is pretty fair about imposterism. What does it look like? What does it feel like? And how do we, as a field, as an association, as a community of practice, best show up for the people who are, to be honest, probably suffering in silence? Because the hard part about psychological phenomena like depression, like anxiety, like imposterism is that we often suffer in silence because we don't want to disclose these feelings of insecurity or inadequacy because they don't make us look good. And Natalie, Scott, and I said, the heck with that. Let's talk about this dang thing. And then let's see where we go. It was liberating to be able to talk about this. You've had a really nice response to the paper. I've been able to give a number of presentations from it. It's great. The part that makes me happiest is that every once in a while you get that message from someone who says, this paper was really important. Let me tell you why. That's why I do all of my work.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing how this study came about and your intentions with it. That's the one thing that I thought about as I was hearing you is you belong in the evaluation couch. That's why the evaluation couch exists. I'm so happy we're bringing this discussion into this space. For those that are listening, you will find the link to the study that we are going to be discussing in this episode in the episode notes. It is called Addressing the Elephant in the Room, Exploring the Imposter Phenomenon in Evaluation. So you can read it and digest all of the amazing findings that are in it. And we'll be sharing some of those findings and what they mean for our evaluation community and our careers in this episode. John, before we get into the results and what they mean for us, can you please help us with some of the definitions? Before we jump into this episode, you shared something with me that I'm going to take away into my ongoing career and coaching career around the difference between using the language of imposter syndrome versus imposter phenomenon. So I would love it if you can share that with the audience and also share how you define that imposter phenomenon in the study.
Yeah, of course. And again, it wasn't just me, it was my wonderful team working together. Full shout out to Scott and Natalie. So here was the thing. When we looked at this idea of the imposter phenomenon, the imposter syndrome, most people, when you talk to them about it, you say, oh, I've got the imposter syndrome. And that didn't feel right to me. And when we looked at the research that other people have done, the definitions that they've worked with, they don't like that definition either because the term syndrome sounds really clinical. It sounds really medical. It makes it sound like I have a communicable disease called imposterism. And if you hang out with me, you're going to get it too. There's nothing wrong with a person who has imposter feelings. Frankly, everybody does. We're born with them. We develop them. Some of them we get over. Some of them we decide are not important. Some of them stick with us longer throughout our life. So in that case, it's not a syndrome. It's a phenomenon. It's an experience. For most people, when they have feelings of imposterism, it's called episodic. It comes and it goes, or it's primed by a certain activity, a topic, an experience. But in fairness, there are some people who struggle with these imposter feelings consistently. Those are the people who deal with the chronic imposter feeling. We were more interested in imposterism in the workplace for evaluators, not this global sense of total fakeness. For people who are listening to this, who maybe feel that more general sense of imposterism or the more consistent one, this is one of those areas where a good counselor is going to be really important. And that's going to be the person who listens to you, who validates your experience, but also pushes back on you and says, here's where your thinking is fair. And here's the areas where your thinking or your emotions are not quite consistent with the facts. So that's why in this paper specifically, we separate imposter phenomenon from the imposter syndrome. So when we talk about imposterism, it's this feeling of being fake. It's this feeling of phoniness. Now, here's the important part. The imposter phenomenon means that you feel fake in spite of having good success. You could be feeling icky and not very good at your work. And if your work is not good, then that's a work quality challenge, which we've all had days like that too. But this is the one where you got a good contract for your evaluation, you carried it through, the client was happy, the stakeholder was happy, but you still feel icky or fake about it. That's what the imposter phenomenon really means. You've done good work, it's been recognized, but you still don't feel real. And when you talk about imposterism, it's made up of these three interrelated components. There's this idea of being fake. Oh, man, I'm not really an evaluator. I'm not really a research methodologist. I'm not really a health person. I don't know what I am, but it's not any of those things. And honestly, we've all had days like that. It's combined with this idea of discounting, which I just alluded to. Any success you've had, oh, it wasn't really that important, right? You sometimes hear about people who have been given awards or recognitions, and they're like, oh, it wasn't really a big deal. Excuse me, it is important to be recognized, but that doesn't help them when they're feeling like an imposter. The third one is luck. And that's the idea of any success that you've had is because you just lucked into it. For example, I could say my paper on the imposter phenomenon has been well received, and it's just because we were lucky. It's just because we had the right team together. Maybe there's a little bit to that. And we had a competent team to ask the questions in a fair and balanced way. So when you have those components together, it leads to this kind of general psychological state, this emotional, so the head and the heart at the same time. It's related to things like depression, work performance, work disengagement, and even physical and mental health. That's why it's really important for us to talk about it in this space. One of the things that Natalie and I were really concerned about is we were concerned that perhaps evaluators as a field were going to be more susceptible to the imposter phenomenon because of the interrelated and interdisciplinary nature of our work. For example, as I think about my identities, I identify as an evaluator first and foremost, followed by a researcher and educator, followed by a psychologist, followed by any of the other hats that I get to wear. Now, that's good in some ways because it means that I can be flexible in where I'm working and the things that I'm doing. But you could imagine someone whose identity has been formed and they say, I'm a psychologist. I am a social psychologist and I look at social phenomena and social biases, and that's what they are. And that's wonderful for them. But evaluators don't always have that because of the way that we're trained. Here's some of the good and some of the bad of our field, the relative inconsistencies and the disagreements within our field about how to prepare people for future work. Where we tend to agree is, yes, you need research methods, statistics, qualitative, mixed methods, all those wonderful things. But where we disagree is, what are the fundamentals of this field of evaluation? And how is it similar or different to our friends in quantitative educational psychology? Similar or different to our friends in economics or public health? As a field, we don't necessarily have that strong long-term identity that some of our sister disciplines do. So that's why we really got into it the way that we did.
Thank you so much. There's so much there to digest. One thing I'm wondering, as I've been reading your paper and thinking about the imposter phenomenon, one thing that usually my brain connects this with is the opposite of it being confidence. Would you agree, or what is the relationship between building our confidence and experiences of imposter phenomenon?
That's a really good question. I'd have to go back, of course, and take a look at the literature. I'm a researcher, I have to say that. Let's go back and look at the evidence around the imposter phenomenon and confidence. But I'd say that they're probably related in some ways, because if you are struggling with an episode of imposterism or a context of imposterism or this chronic imposterism, that means that you don't have confidence. So my guess is they're quite related, but the way that we define these ideas, people are going to have difference of opinions about them. My suggestion, though, would be to deal with imposterism. It's not enough to, and here's the air quotes, to simply increase somebody's self-confidence, because that doesn't really deal with the underlying phenomenon of discounting or luck. All it deals with is this emotional state of here I am to do my work and my projects. Now, that's good in the short term, but it doesn't deal with the longer term concerns that a person has. So we need both. Now, again, we could have someone who's very confident in their work and not competent. That's not good either. What I'm talking about here are people who are competent in the work but don't feel like they are. And again, that's very hard.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I'm very curious to learn from you what you found, and we're going to reflect on this a little bit. How does the experience of imposter phenomenon in evaluation compared to other fields? I also would have thought that it is increased because of all of the factors that shape how evaluators see ourselves within other disciplines, within our own sectors that we work in. And that's the next question I had for you. I know you touched on it lightly, but what are some factors that are unique to our evaluation profession that shape this imposter phenomenon?
Yeah, that's a great question, Maria. I'd say that one of the things where we struggle, and I'm going to use the word that none of us want to talk about, it's called theory. All right. All right. It's out. We've talked about it. It's some of the theories and the approaches to evaluation that we use. Because evaluation is a transdisciplinary area, because it is so applied, a lot of the curricula, when I look at universities in the United States and across the world, there isn't a very big apparent emphasis on the different models and approaches to doing evaluation. And by models and approaches, I don't mean quantitative or qualitative or mixed methods. Those are a part of it, but the actual steps that we take in an evaluation. How do we reconcile our identity? How do we reconcile our positionality? How do we approach our community partners, or have they approached us? Whose questions do we prioritize? All of that's before we even talk about anything related to measurement. That's one of the big ones. I'll be honest, when I started learning about evaluation formally, I thought, oh, I don't want to learn about theory. I just want to learn how to do this stuff. And it wasn't until I learned about theory formally in a class taught by Tina Christie that began to click to me. When she was talking about theory, she didn't mean just the tools. She meant the whole process of evaluation. That's where I started to really think, oh, there's really something here. But then it wasn't until I started to teach the theory class myself that everything really came together. It's the whole story. It's our philosophy, our approach, our understanding to, again, who are we and how do we show up and why that a theory can really tell us. I don't want to make it sound like any of the theories are particularly good or particularly bad, but they all have trade-offs. So if you're going to do an empowerment approach evaluation, that's wonderful. It has to make sense for the community that you're trying to serve. Or if you're doing utilization focused or participatory, any of these approaches can be good, but they have to be done well and with fidelity to the people who designed them so that they can lead to the outcomes, the changes in our community partners and the people that they serve. Because we don't have that, that often leads to a sense of fakeness and imposterism, especially when people come to my workshops and they want to learn about theory. They say, this is something I never had, or I never had growing up. I just learned to do evaluation by doing it. I understand that. A lot of us are like that. And yet there has to be a better, more systematic way to do it. Teaching about theory in a way that's non-threatening and is putting these different approaches on same footing is a way of addressing that.
So one question I have for clarification is, are you implying that increasing our understanding of evaluation theory or the lack of spread wide understanding of how theory influences practice is one of the reasons why evaluators may experience imposter phenomenon?
It's an empirical question. When you look at some of our sister disciplines, education, psychology, social work, public health, they have established theories and models and ways of doing the work, right? Most of us come to evaluation late in our educational careers. We are then comparing evaluation processes to our other disciplines, our other areas. And we see that public health has this approach. Why doesn't evaluation have that? Education uses very specific terms, praxis, positionality. Psychology uses specific terms as well. These are really important. But If you don't have those in evaluation because you didn't learn them through part of your educational processes, you then to start make this outward, downward comparison, or I should say upward comparison. This other field has these terms and ideas. Why doesn't evaluation? And that is really where that feeling in the pit of your stomach of, oh God, what am I missing here? What else am I missing? That's where that luck, discount, fake, that's where a lot of those feelings probably come from. What I would add to that as well, and this is where things get really hard, is when you have other people, perhaps there are people that you report to, community partners that you're trying to support, when they think evaluation is a very specific thing, and they are the ones signing the check, or they're the ones who are reviewing you for promotion or other things, and they don't see evaluation the same way you do, but you don't have the language to defend what evaluation is for you, that's where an outside comparison, but top down comparison comes into play. And boy, oh boy, is that nasty, especially right now in the political climate in the United States. We have a lot of that, and it's hard. It's really hard.
Thank you so much for that. I know that another one that we have discussed and that comes up in your paper is the strong ties between evaluation and academia and how evaluation is taught. So can you share a little bit more about how that shapes our experiences of imposterism?
Yeah. Okay. So what I would say to that is I'm going to put academic preparation, university programs in the same bucket as communities of practice, reading groups, or the training and education we get at our conferences, putting all those things in a similar bucket. Those things, I believe, and I think future studies, the data would probably bear this out, when you participate in an educational experience, you often have a person leading a discussion. You, as the learner, are doing an upward comparison. You're comparing yourself to that person when they're talking about whatever it is, whether it's an approach to evaluation, a data analysis tool, or a visual representation of storytelling, whatever it is, you're making a comparison between yourself and that person. The problem is that comparison is not always fair because you're comparing yourself with comparatively little or less experience with someone who has a heck of a lot more. And that's really hard. And when I teach my classes, I tell them all about the mistakes that I've made. I've made more than a few mistakes in my career, in my life, but I've tried to learn from them. So by saying you can do this approach or this tool or that tool, I've done these and this is where they've worked. This is where I've made mistakes. You'll make mistakes too. My hope is that you won't make the same ones that I do. I'm trying through my language and behavior to let them know it's okay to make those mistakes as long as you learn from them. As long as no one got hurt, things are going to be okay. But in most professional or high level educational experiences, we don't always lead sessions with that kind of tone. Some of our colleagues are really good at that. Some are not so good at that. And the really technical descriptions, the high powered ones, that can leave the person feeling even more fake at the end of it. And there's one other component that goes into education. It's this idea of when you start an experience, your sense of skill, your sense of competence is artificially inflated because you haven't had experience with that topic or that skill yet. And as you go through the experience, your perceived competence or your perceived skill level actually drops. But it's dropping because your expectations are now more aligned with your actual skill level. And so by the end, if you look at a pre-training and a post-training session, usually you're going to see people starting off saying they know a lot, and by the end, it's dropped a little bit. That's actually okay because it's more grounded. So for example, I'm lucky enough that I've taught couple day long workshops on how to do a focus group. I love it. I think it's just so cool. I have students and working professionals tell me that they've done focus groups. They know a lot about it. They just want some of the foundational stuff. By the end of 2 days, they realize there's a lot more to designing and implementing a good focus group study than they ever realized before because I'm taking the toys off of the shelf and showing them where they work and showing my students where are the things a little bit sharp, and where can you hurt yourself or others if you're not careful with them? So that's where I look at education as one of the ways of addressing imposterism. Communities of practice, discussion groups, things like that are also really important, but they have to be grounded so that the person who's feeling fake or discounting or just lucky, their experience is recognized, it's validated. There could be some truth to that, but is challenged in a constructive way. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And one thing I appreciate from what you're saying that also comes through the paper is that as an evaluation community, we have a role to play. Yes, it's an individual experience, but as a community, we can support people's feeling safe in sharing that experience they're having. But then also, as you're saying, in challenging and in how we frame learning in a way that diminishes that potential comparison that people experience. I really appreciated hearing that. So now let's get into the findings. What did your research study find in terms of the experiences of imposterism within evaluators?
Yeah. Oh, there's so much there. There's
Oh,
a lot. There's a lot going in there. So there's a couple of kind of active ingredients. Before I get into the actual findings, I just want to say that for me, at least, one of the people that I really look up to is no longer with us in the world, but it's Fred Rogers. You may remember him from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and other youth-oriented programming. What I appreciated about Fred Rogers is that he said anything that is discussable is manageable. As I get older, I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, but I like the ethos of it. Things are most scary when we can't talk about them. And so as we talk about imposterism, the purpose of this study was to take some of the fear of the experience away and say, no, you're not alone in this. I have it. John has it. Maria has it. Natalie and Scott have had it. We've all had it. So we can talk about it. So I think there's a couple interesting ingredients in terms of the findings. The first being that although people who identify as evaluators, we all have the imposter phenomenon. We've all had it at some point in a project, in the work life. Most of the people who said that they had experienced it did not say that it was very severe. It was that middle range, uncomfortable, but not something that was going to drive them away from the work. Does that make sense? They were able to recognize the feelings. They were able to find ways of working through them and then continue on with the project in general. But about a third, they felt like a fake or an imposter about a third of the time. And I'll be honest, I have a hard time reconciling feeling fake a third of the time and saying it's not very severe. I have a hard time with that, Maria. Do you?
yeah, I was very surprised to see that people mention that it's not very severe. And it goes against my experience as a career coach and all the connections I've had with evaluators across
Yeah.
the world.
Yeah. Those two data points don't seem to agree. What I wonder is as people get there, so there's a inverse relationship with imposter feelings and age. So as we get older, as we get more experience, we tend to have less of them. I don't know for sure. We'd have to go back to the data and look, but I wonder if there's some sort of interaction happening here where they are feeling like a fake, but maybe they become used to it. Maybe it's just the price of doing business, as it were. And yet, I'm still not entirely happy with that explanation either, because in the study, we didn't ask, what specific parts of your work make you feel fake or make you feel like an imposter? And in retrospect, of course, retrospect is always retrospect. I wish I had asked that question because that would give me more specific ways of providing supports. Because if people feel fake because they feel inadequate because of the academic preparation they have, there are ways to talk about that. As a career coach, I think if I'm going to put words in your mouth and hopefully they're right, part of it is just re-describing the skills and knowledge that you have for different audiences. And so maybe that's a part of it. But if a lot of our feelings of fake are around specific research methods or data reporting, that's a different kind of support that people might need. But I think, and this was one of the things that we talked about earlier, evaluators, we like to have information. We like doing research. We like reading things. And when we don't feel good about something, one of our first responses is, I need to learn more about it. That's a good thing in some ways, but we don't want the learning more about something to become this hamster wheel where we always have to learn more. We always have to be the best. We have to, at some point, be comfortable with what we know. And at some point, we have to be comfortable with what we don't know. For me, what that might mean is if I'm feeling fake because I have a project in Canada and I don't know a lot about the Canadian context, I can either try to do a crash course myself on Canada and the health system and the education system, or I could look to building out my evaluation team with people who can support me. That's the other part about imposterism, is that it tends to be very individualized. I feel this. I need to do better than I am doing now. Is it worth it to try to do more training, more education, or is it better to build better relationships or stronger relationships? And I think, of course, the answer is it depends. It depends on the topic, the project, the length of it, and your role in the project. And I'd say there's probably a happy medium in between. I kind of see you nodding your head.
What you said about the learning and the hamster wheel has 100% been what I have observed as a career coach as the way of evaluators coping with imposter phenomenon, with lack of confidence, with career insatisfaction. Like this idea of, if I just have another training under my resume, if I take this other course, then I'm going to be able to grow in my career. When in reality, it really depends. And most of the times I would add to what you said, it's not only about what collaborations we can bring into our practice to make up for areas you feel are missing, but it's also, how do you work on yourself? How do you work on that internal experience that you have of not feeling adequate or enough? Explore that, receive the support for that. Because if you have not really addressed that, then you can have as much training as you want. You can have the most amazing lines on your resume, but that's not going to go away.
I forget where the phrase comes from, but if you're not enough as a person without the training, you'll never be enough as a person, even with the training. I kind of think we can read into that however we want. One of the things that really surprised me about what the process and the story that this study told me is that men and women have some different coping strategies when they feel fake. I'll be perfectly honest with you. It seems like the techniques that the women are using are probably healthier in large than the ones that the men are. Boy, am I going to get emails about that. I'm sure about it. But look at it this way. In general, people try to do more research. There was a lot of consistency between the men and the women for that one. But then when it comes to the collaborative addressing of the imposter phenomenon itself, women seem to report talking to others or focusing on past accomplishments. Those tended to be the big things that the people who identified as women did to address their issues. I didn't ask them if they were talking with a community of practice or a therapist, but they're talking about it. For the people who identify as men, they tend to be much more passive or self-focused approaches to dealing with it. So this idea of, I'm just going to work harder. Great. Okay, I believe you. You're just going to try to work harder. That may not really deal with the underlying issue. They want to ignore or avoid the feelings or situations where that happens. They're human. Of course, they're going to try to avoid that. But if you avoid it, you don't really deal with it. I just don't have those feelings. Yeah, I think you actually do, but you just don't want to talk about it.
I have a follow-up to that. In your study, did you find that women report experiencing imposter phenomenon more often than men?
No,
Interesting.
no. And I'm really happy to see that. I am really happy to see that. If we were in a field where the experience for women was different, better, or worse than the experience for men, or the experience of people of different ethnicities and identities was significantly different from others, we would have a problem. I would take that as an indicator of systematic bias or systematic issues that need to be addressed. I was so happy that there were no differences between sexes or racial identities in this particular study. I was grateful for that, which means the things that could work for some could be good for all of us, if that makes sense.
One thing that I found really interesting was the topic of confidence and gender is something that I'm very interested in. And I had read a book before I read your paper called The Confidence Code. It's by Katty and Shipman. They look into the experience of women and confidence and how it compares to men. I'll have the book also in the episode notes for those that are interested in it. But one of their findings actually, I think, make a lot of sense with what you found in terms of the coping mechanisms. One of the things that they find in terms of how to increase your confidence is to stop overthinking and ruminating on feelings of inadequacy, which align with some of those coping mechanisms you saw come up more frequently among men. So things like avoiding feelings like this, repressing these feelings, like basically it sounds more like moving on. Like I'm not really going to pay as much attention to these. And what they found in their research is that's actually a good strategy to increase your confidence, which I found interesting. Another thing I'm wondering from your research is these are coping mechanisms, but do we know anything about how effective they are?
As of right now, for looking at evaluators, this was a one-shot study. It was like taking the thermometer, the read of how are we doing as a field? I think at some point we are definitely going to need to do some follow-up projects. And for the record, I'm always interested in collaboration with neat people. So if you're interested in this, we can definitely have a conversation. Although I don't know right now the effectiveness of group level interventions to help individual level feelings, the people who participated in the study, we did give them the option to say, what are one or two things that you think would be helpful? What are one or two bits of advice that you would like to give, either, for example, me as an educator or to the American Evaluation Association to help deal with imposter feelings? They did say things like normalizing this emotion, this feeling. Just talk about it. We can talk about these things. They did talk about this idea of mentorship, either formal or informal mentorship, with the caveat that if you're going to have a mentor who's going to help you with your emotions and your thoughts, make sure it's someone who is going to listen and reflect and support you in it, not just steamroll over your feelings and say, no, you're really good. I don't know why you're feeling that way. Get out of it. All that kind of junk that we do as human beings to each other is not really helpful. A good mentor or good group of mentors is very helpful. And that's where, again, I look to my mentors, Hallie Preskill, Stuart Donaldson, Tara Kazam. I look to them and I say, what would they do? What would they think? And when I'm really having a rough day, I can reach out to them and say, man, I am just having one hell of a time here. Can we talk about this? That's helpful. The people who responded to the study also said socialization into the community is a good thing and being more systematic about that. For example, AEA does this, and I think CES does this as well, where you have ambassadors, people new to the field to help shepherd new participants into the conference, into the societies, but doing those things with a psychological lens and an educational lens could be very helpful. Providing supports for the mentors and the people doing the socialization could be very helpful. Last, they talked about communities of practice and support systems, which are good and wonderful. With telecommunications these days, we can do it in person or virtual distance. They can both be good, but what's really important here is the relationship you have with the other person, your ability to trust them, to listen, to reflect, and to push back against your thinking in ways that are going to be helpful. If they see something that you did wrong or that you're lacking in, having the courage to tell you that. Because that's not an easy conversation either. But that's what you need your mentor and your supports to be able to do.
Very valuable. And I know that all of this is captured in your paper. So if anyone wants to read more and learn more of the details of what the findings are, definitely make sure that you read it. As we wrap up, John, I'd love to hear from you how you think that evaluators can leverage these findings to support their careers.
But I think there's a couple of active ingredients in here. I want to come back to something we talked about early on. So, this idea of luck, discount, fake, a lot of those things are related to this kind of unfair comparisons that we make with other people. So, I might, for example, compare myself to my mentors or the people I admire, wherever they are in their career track. And that may not be fair. There's another comparison people who struggle with imposterism do, and it's this comparison with an unknown ideal. This is the person who should be able to do this or should be able to do that. It's that comparison because you don't have a benchmark. You don't have an actual person to compare yourself with. It's just this unknown. And that's really hard. Working through communities of practice and mentorship can really help push back against an unknown comparison. But just know that you're going to do it, whether you're reading an empirical article or something in one of the journals, or in my case, I still read science fiction and fantasy books, and I still do comparisons to some of the characters in my favorite book, which is Ender's Game. It's not a fair comparison because the characters in that book are not real, but I still do it anyway, and it's not fair. So I would say to our friends, our colleagues, is be kind to yourself, number one. Be fair to yourself, number two, and support the people around you. The more that you are willing and able to disclose things that are going well for you or that are struggling for you, the more that other people are going to be able to open up. And again, the evidence that I have for that is when I teach, the first thing out of every class session is 5-10 minutes. Hey, gang, what's going on in your lives? How are you doing? Is there something good that happened in the last week that you can share? And it could be the grand thing of they had a medical treatment, or they are looking into getting into recovery, or it could be something important to them. They had a good first date, or they started looking for job opportunities. The more that we have the foundation of talking about the good things that are going on in our life, the stronger foundation we're going to have for talking about the things that we're struggling with. And if we have good conversations with good people, good things will happen. And data bears that out.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and all of your findings. Is there anything else you want to share before we wrap up this episode?
Thank you for having me on. What a great chance to talk about things that I care about. I hope it's helpful to other people. Be strange people, but don't be strangers. As you have ideas about things that we could study or work on together, reach out to them. If you find someone who's written something or said something you admire, reach out to them. A little bit of kindness goes an awful long way, and you never know what they're going through when that message is going to reach them. Always be kind.
If you found this episode helpful, make sure you follow The Evaluation Couch on Apple and Spotify podcasts. I'm here to help you build the evaluation career that you deserve. Make sure you follow me on LinkedIn, where I share career tips and resources. And if you're ready to become a confident evaluator that attracts top evaluation opportunities, download my free workbook, which you can find in the episode notes.